You're listening to Audiology. Support our work on Patreon and be sure to submit your requests for topics in the comments below. Introduction. In the infamous Supreme Court case of Dred Scott v. Sanford in 1857, the court determined that individuals of African descent were not entitled to American citizenship, and as a consequence, were ineligible to receive the protections and rights that the Constitution ensures for citizens. This judgment has garnered significant criticism for its explicit racism, poor legal logic, and its contribution to the mounting tensions that led to the outbreak of the Civil War. Notable legal expert Bernard Schwartz rated it as the most egregious Supreme Court decision, and Chief Justice Charles Evans Hughes later referred to it as a self-damaging act by the court. Dred Scott, a black man who had been enslaved, had been taken by his enslavers from a slave state, Missouri, into territories where slavery was prohibited. Upon returning to Missouri, Scott sued for his freedom, claiming his residence in free territories made him a free man. Despite initial lawsuits in Missouri State Court and then federal court, both ruled against him. The Supreme Court's majority opinion, authored by Chief Justice Roger Taney, declared that African Americans could not be citizens and thus could not sue in federal court. Additionally, Taney's decision invalidated the Missouri Compromise, which had restricted slavery in certain territories, on the grounds it was unconstitutional to limit a slave owner's rights to their property. Far from resolving the contention around slavery, this ruling only heightened the discord among states, aligning with the interests of slave-holding states, but provoking outrage elsewhere. The judgment intensified the national debate over slavery, contributing to the polarization that ultimately culminated in the Civil War. The decision was eventually nullified by the 13th and 14th Amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which abolished slavery and guaranteed citizenship to all persons born or naturalized in the U.S. Historians universally see the Dred Scott decision as catastrophic for the nation, fueling divisions over slavery. Its attempt to impose a judicial solution to the slavery issue by asserting a constitutional right to own slaves across the U.S., while permanently stripping African Americans of citizenship, is cited as a stark example of judicial activism. By overturning the Missouri Compromise, a move seen as unnecessary given its replacement by the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the court was accused of overreach. The ruling was a key issue in the 1860 presidential election. The Republican Party and its candidate Abraham Lincoln opposed the decision, viewing it as partisan and illegitimate. Lincoln's stance on limiting slavery's expansion, which was directly at odds with the court's decision, was a pivotal factor in prompting Southern states to secede and thereby setting the stage for the Civil War. Political setting. In the early 19th century, following the United States' acquisition of a large land area from France, known as the Louisiana Purchase, a significant political conflict emerged. The controversy was about whether the new states formed from this territory should allow slavery, like the Southern states, or prohibit it, as in the Northern states. Southern states favored the expansion of slavery to bolster their political and economic influence, while Northern states opposed it for their own political, economic, and moral reasons. To address this tension, the Missouri Compromise was enacted by Congress in 1820. This legislation balanced interests by allowing Maine to join the Union as a state where slavery was banned, and at the same time, Missouri was accepted as a state where slavery was permitted. The compromise also declared that slavery would be forbidden in future states north of the latitude line 36°30' north, which covered most of the remaining territory. The legality of slave owners moving their slaves into this nominally free northern area, and the overall legality of the Missouri Compromise, eventually became central issues in the landmark Dred Scott decision. Dred Scott and John Emerson. Dred Scott was an enslaved individual, thought to have been born in Virginia around the end of the 18th century. His life prior to adulthood is largely unknown. His enslaver, Peter Blow, relocated to Alabama in 1818 and brought Scott and 5 other enslaved people to work on a farm near Huntsville. In 1830, Blow stopped farming and moved to St. Louis, Missouri, where he sold Scott to an army doctor named Dr. John Emerson. Dr. Emerson brought Scott along when he was stationed at Fort Armstrong in Illinois, a state where slavery was outlawed both as a result of the state's constitution, which banned slavery since its admission to the Union in 1819, and the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, which prohibited slavery in the territories that later became Illinois. A few years later, in 1836, Emerson and Scott relocated again, this time to Fort Snelling in what is today Minnesota, but was then part of the Wisconsin Territory. The Wisconsin Territory was also a region where slavery was banned by the Missouri Compromise. While at Fort Snelling, Scott married Harriet Robinson in a formal ceremony officiated by her owner, Major Lawrence Taliaferro, who was a justice of the peace and an Indian agent. Given that slave marriages were not legally recognized, the formal ceremony implies that Scott was considered free at that time. Later, in 1837, Emerson received military reassignment to Jefferson Barracks military post near St. Louis, but he left Scott and his wife at Fort Snelling. While they remained there, Emerson arranged to hire out Scott's and Harriet's labor, profiting from their work. In doing this, Emerson was introducing and perpetuating slavery in free states, which contradicted the stipulations of the Missouri Compromise, the Northwest Ordinance, and the Wisconsin Enabling Act that governed the Wisconsin Territory. Irene Sanford Emerson. Before the year's end, Emerson was transferred to Fort Jesup in Louisiana. There, in February 1838, he wed Eliza Irene Sanford. Soon after, he summoned Scott and Harriet to Louisiana to attend to him and his new wife. But not long after their arrival, Emerson received orders to return to Fort Snelling. While traveling there, Scott's daughter, Eliza, was born free according to federal and state laws, since her birth occurred on a steamboat on the Mississippi River in a region that would become part of free territory. Despite this, the Scott family did not take legal action for their freedom in Louisiana, where it is believed they could likely have been successful due to precedents in the state courts over the past 2 decades that favored slaves brought into free territories for extended stays. Emerson moved back to Fort Snelling by late 1838. By 1840, his wife took the Scotts to St. Louis and hired them out while Emerson fought in the Seminole War. Emerson left military service in 1842 and passed away in the Iowa Territory the following year. His widow, Irene, inherited all he owned, including the Scotts. She continued to lease the Scotts out for 3 years. When Scott offered to buy his family's freedom in 1846 and was refused, he turned to the legal system for help. Scott v. Emerson, First State Circuit Court Trial. Dred Scott was a man who tried unsuccessfully to buy his own freedom and consequently took legal action against Emerson in the St. Louis County Circuit Court on April 6, 1846, to gain his liberty. Alongside his wife Harriet, they filed separate lawsuits, marking the first instance of a married couple jointly asserting their right to freedom in the court's 5 decades of operation. They were financially backed by the family of Dred's former owner, Peter Blow, whose daughter was married to Joseph Charles, an official at the Bank of Missouri. Charles has not only provided a financial guarantee for the Scotts, but also arranged for the bank's lawyer, Samuel Mansfield Bay, to represent them in court, where it was largely anticipated that they would successfully attain their freedom. This belief was due to numerous previous cases in Missouri, where former slaves had secured their freedom by demonstrating they or their mothers had resided in free states or territories. Notable cases influencing this included Winnie v. Whitesides in 1824, which set the precedent in Missouri that if a slave had lived in a free state like Illinois, they became free, and Rachel v. Walker, where the court ruled that a military officer lost his rights to enslave a person if he took them to and kept them in a territory where slavery was forbidden. Dred Scott's legal representation changed hands multiple times, from the initially appointed Francis B. Murdoch to Charles D. Drake, and finally to Samuel M. Bay. The opposing lawyer, George W. Good, defended Irene Emerson and her pro-slavery stance. Despite the judicial shuffle, including the change of judges from the pro-slavery Judge John M. Crum to the more freedom suit-friendly Judge Alexander Hamilton, Scott's case did not go to court until June 30th, 1847. In the ensuing trial, Henry Peter Blow confirmed that his father had indeed owned and subsequently sold Dred Scott to John Emerson. Witnesses supported Scott's claim that he had lived in free territories with Dr. Emerson. However, Grocer Samuel Russell's evidence suggesting he had contracted with Irene Emerson to hire the Scotts was dismissed as hearsay because he revealed that the agreements had been made by his wife, not himself. Consequently, despite the evidence and expectations, the jury ruled in favor of Emerson, resulting in an apparently paradoxical situation. The court's verdict reaffirmed Scott's status as Irene Emerson's slave due to the legal technicality that he could not prove his prior status as her property. First State Supreme Court Appeal. Bay requested a retrial immediately for Scott, arguing that a technical flaw, not the substance of the case, caused the original loss. Judge Hamilton granted this retrial on December 2, 1847. However, 2 days after the order, Emerson's attorney contested the decision by filing a bill of exceptions, and the case was subsequently escalated to the Missouri Supreme Court. Scott's new legal team, comprising Alexander P. Field and David N. Hall, contended that the writ of error was misapplied as the lower court hadn't delivered a final decision yet. The Missouri Supreme Court found in favor of this view and unanimously ruled to reject Emerson's appeal on June 30, 1848, focusing solely on the legal process rather than the actual merits of the case. Second State Circuit Court Trial. Prior to the State Supreme Court assembling, Good, acting on Emerson's behalf, filed a request to have Scott detained and temporarily employed by another party. On March 17, 1848, Judge Hamilton gave the directive to the St. Louis County Sheriff. Individuals who wished to employ Scott were required to secure a $600 bond. The income Scott earned during this period was held in a trust to be awarded to whoever ultimately won the legal dispute. Scott would continue to be under the sheriff's supervision or leased out by him until March 18, 1857. On March 17, 1849, one of Scott's attorneys, David N. Hall, began employing him. External events like the St. Louis Fire of 1849, a widespread cholera outbreak, and 2 legal postponements delayed Scott's retrial in the St. Louis Circuit Court until January 12, 1850. Irene Emerson's defense was now led by Hugh A. Garland and Lyman D. Norris, with Scott being represented by Field and Hall under Judge Alexander Hamilton. The trial proceedings mirrored those of the first trial. They reused depositions from Catherine A. Anderson and Miles H. Clark to demonstrate that Dr. Emerson had brought Scott into territories where slavery was not legal. This time, they avoided the hearsay issue with a statement from Adeline Russell, indicating she leased the Scotts from Irene Emerson, thus confirming Irene's ownership claim. Samuel Russell also reaffirmed in court that he had paid for the Scotts' services. The defense shifted their argument, contending that Mrs. Emerson had the right to hire out Dred Scott because his time with Dr. Emerson at the military sites of Fort Armstrong and Fort Snelling was under military, not civil law, thereby bypassing the Rachel V. Walker precedent. In response, Hall argued that the military designation did not invalidate Scott's claim to freedom and mentioned that Dr. Emerson had left Scott leased to others at Fort Snelling when reassigned. The jury swiftly ruled in favor of Dred Scott, effectively granting him freedom, and Judge Hamilton also declared Harriet, Eliza, and Lizzie Scott free. Garland immediately requested a new trial, which was denied. On February 13, 1850, the defense challenged the ruling, lodging a bill of exceptions certified by Judge Hamilton, leading to another Missouri Supreme Court appeal. Both parties agreed that going forward, only Dred Scott v. Irene Emerson would be pursued, with the outcome affecting Harriet's case as well. Meanwhile, in 1849 or 1850, Irene Emerson moved to Springfield, Massachusetts, leaving John F. A. Sanford, her brother, to handle her affairs, though this did not influence the ongoing case. Second State Supreme Court Appeal. On March 8, 1850, legal representatives for both sides submitted their formal arguments to the Missouri Supreme Court concerning a case on the docket. The court's schedule was so full that they couldn't review the case until their October session. At this point, the societal debate regarding slavery had escalated tensions, even among the judges. Historically, the Missouri Supreme Court had ruled in favor of maintaining slavery, and in the 1840s, they made clear their reluctance to free enslaved individuals. During the court session that started on October 25, 1850, two judges inclined towards pro-slavery views and aligned with the anti-Benton Democratic Party, William Barclay Knapton and James Harvey Birch, joined forces with John Ferguson Ryland, a Democrat with Benton ties, to unanimously rule that Dred Scott should remain enslaved under Missouri statutes. However, the written decision was postponed, and further delays occurred when Knapton and Birch lost their judicial positions after Missouri's first Supreme Court election in August 1851, leaving only Ryland in his post. The case had to be reassessed by the new court, which included judges with more moderate views and one staunchly pro-slavery judge, William Scott. Dred Scott's lawyer, David N. Hall, had written the initial briefs but passed away in March 1851. Alexander P. Field then shouldered the responsibility for Scott's case, resubmitting the previous documents from 1850 for consideration on both sides. The case was reviewed based on these documents on November 29, 1851, and a decision was made, but before the court's opinion could be detailed by Judge Scott, Lyman Norris, who represented the opposing party, received approval to present a new brief to replace the initial one. In this new submission, Norris strongly condemned the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and the Missouri Compromise, questioning their relevance and criticizing the early Missouri Supreme Court's rulings, especially those made by Justice George Tompkins. Norris recognized that if past court decisions like Rachel v. Walker stood, his client's case would be negatively affected. Nevertheless, he disputed the once free, always free doctrine, stating that previous decisions were incorrect and insisting that the Missouri Compromise should not overrule Missouri law or acknowledge laws from other states that might lead to the loss of a Missourian's property. Norris's argument was supported by a previous U.S. Supreme Court case, which suggested that a state where slavery was legal should be the one to determine the status of an enslaved person returning from a free state. Historian Walter Ehrlich pointed out that in the latter part of Norris's brief, he resorted to racially charged language, which not only uncovered his biases, but also demonstrated how the Dred Scott case transitioned from a freedom lawsuit to a politically controversial topic. Later, the court's final verdict would incorporate many of the pro-slavery points from Norris's argument. On March 22, 1852, Judge William Scott delivered the Missouri Supreme Court's ruling, affirming that Dred Scott was to remain in slavery and overturning the lower court's judgment. Judge Ryland agreed with this decision, while Chief Justice Hamilton Gamble opposed it. The majority opinion focused on the concept of comity or the respect for other states' laws, stressing the rhetoric of state sovereignty. Judge Scott acknowledged the Missouri Compromise's prohibitions against slavery in specific territories, but maintained that an enslaved person would only be free within the borders of a free state. He omitted acknowledgement of the precedent where freedom once granted meant enduring freedom. To justify this shift away from decades of prior legal decisions, he argued that the current societal context surrounding slavery called for a change in stance. The following day after the ruling, the legal team for Irene Emerson, who claimed ownership over Scott, filed a motion in the St. Louis Circuit Court to ensure the Blow family covered the court costs through bonds they signed to secure the return of the Scott family as property and to transfer earnings the Scott family had made over 4 years with additional interest. Judge Hamilton later dismissed this request on June 29, 1852. Scott v. Sanford. The situation appeared bleak for the Blow family as they ran out of funds to cover Scott's legal expenses. Scott was left without legal representation after his attorneys Alexander Field relocated to Louisiana and David Hall passed away. Fortunately, Roswell Field took on Scott's case without charging a fee. He allowed Scott to work for him as a janitor. Roswell Field conferred with LeBaume, the individual who had assumed the Scott's lease in 1851, about the matter. After the state Supreme Court's decision, a motion by Emerson's legal team to obtain the rent held in escrow was denied by Judge Hamilton, who also refused to hand over the slaves to their owner. In 1853, Dred Scott launched a new lawsuit against his owner, John Sanford, in a federal court because Sanford had moved back to New York, enabling federal jurisdiction based on diversity of citizenship outlined in the Constitution. Scott included new allegations that Sanford had physically attacked his family and detained them for 6 hours at the beginning of the year. During the 1854 trial, Judge Robert William Wells instructed the jury to consider Missouri state law to decide on Scott's freedom status. In line with the Missouri Supreme Court's earlier ruling that Scott was still a slave, the jury ruled in Sanford's favor. Scott then took his case to the U.S. Supreme Court. However, a clerical error occurred, and the defendant's name was misspelled as Sanford, leading to a persistently incorrect case title. In the Supreme Court, Scott's defense team included Montgomery Blair and George Ticknor Curtis, the latter being the brother of a Supreme Court justice. Sanford's representation came from Reverdy Johnson and Henry S. Geyer. Sanford as defendant. The lawsuit began with both parties acknowledging a claimed transaction where Scott was supposedly sold by Dr. Emerson to John Sanford. However, this claim wasn't rooted in reality. Dr. Emerson had passed away in 1843, and Dred Scott had initially sued Irene Emerson, Dr. Emerson's widow, in 1847. There wasn't any documentation to show that Scott had been legally transferred to Sanford or that he was later returned to Irene Emerson. Moreover, Sanford passed away before Scott gained his freedom, and Scott's name was absent from Sanford's will's inventory. Sanford had not been assigned the role of executor for Dr. Emerson's estate by any court, and by the time the federal lawsuit was initiated, Dr. Emerson's estate had already been settled. The vague details surrounding Scott's ownership led to speculation that the case was engineered intentionally to serve as a legal litmus test. This view was compounded by the fact that Mrs. Emerson had remarried Calvin C. Chaffee, an abolitionist congressman, which raised eyebrows. Despite doubts about his actual ownership of Scott, Sanford had been engaged in the legal contest since it began in 1847, well before his sister married Chaffee. He had provided a lawyer for his sister for the earlier state lawsuit and hired the same attorney to defend him in the federal suit. Sanford also agreed to be represented by genuine pro-slavery lawyers before the Supreme Court and did not merely present a symbolic opposition. Influence of President Buchanan. Before the Supreme Court made a decision on a significant case, President-elect James Buchanan reached out to his associate, Justice John Catron, to find out if the verdict would be announced prior to his inauguration in March 1857. Buchanan was hoping for a resolution from the court that would address the national dispute over slavery by removing it from the realm of political controversy. He went on to exert influence on Justice Robert Cooper Grier, who was from the North, to side with the justices from the South in the Dred Scott case, aiming to create the impression of a unified decision beyond regional bias. Historian Paul Finkelman noted that Buchanan was inappropriately privy to the court's direction on the case, as Justice Grier, who shared Buchanan's Pennsylvanian ties, had been disclosing details about the ongoing deliberations within the court. Subsequently, when Buchanan encouraged the public to abide by the court's ruling, he was already aware of what Chief Justice Taney would declare. Republican concerns about potential misconduct were indeed substantiated. Furthermore, in her biography, Jean H. Baker points out that Buchanan's involvement in trying to influence a Supreme Court justice was, and remains, considered highly inappropriate. The Republicans heightened suspicions about Buchanan's possible sway on the court by revealing that Chief Justice Taney had covertly informed him of the court's decision. In his inaugural speech, Buchanan had expressed confidence that the Supreme Court would soon put the contentious issue of slavery to rest. Supreme Court decision. On the 6th of March in 1857, The Supreme Court in the United States delivered a lengthy verdict, spanning more than 200 printed pages, in the case regarding Dred Scott. In a majority ruling, with 7 justices against 2, the court decided against Scott. Each of the 9 justices provided their individual perspectives on the case in writing. However, the primary point of contention and debate has been the predominant opinion expressed by the majority of the justices. Opinion of the Court. The Supreme Court, led by Chief Justice Roger Taney, had a majority of 7 justices who agreed on a decision regarding the case's fundamental question. If individuals of African descent, whose forefathers were brought to America and sold as slaves, could claim federal citizenship as defined by the U.S. Constitution. Taney asked if such individuals could participate in the political life created by the Constitution and enjoy the rights and freedoms it promised to its citizens. The court's verdict was negative, ruling that African Americans could not be considered American citizens, which in turn meant they could not initiate lawsuits in federal courts based on diversity of citizenship, a requirement outlined in Article 3 of the Constitution. Chief Justice Taney argued that enslaved Africans and their descendants were not and were never meant to be included in the term citizens, as mentioned in the Constitution. He outlined that at the founding of America, black people were viewed as a lower and inferior group dominated by whites. They had no inherent rights, except for what those in power chose to grant them. Taney supported his point by referring to historical state laws, suggesting they were designed to create a permanent separation between black individuals and whites, particularly in terms of citizenship. Taney believed that the prevailing opinion during the time of America's founding saw black people as inherently subordinate, with no claim to rights, a white man was obligated to acknowledge. Expanding his ruling beyond the immediate case, he judged the Missouri Compromise as unconstitutional. The compromise, which aimed to restrict slavery above a certain northern latitude in U.S. territories, was found to violate slave owners' Fifth Amendment rights by unlawfully depriving them of their property, i.e., slaves, without due process. The court's ruling ultimately stated that because slaves were seen as property affirmed in the Constitution, Congress had overstepped its constitutional bounds by passing a law that prohibited slavery in certain U.S. territories. Taney's assessment was based on a strict reading of the Property Clause, arguing that it should only apply to properties possessed collectively by the states at the time the Constitution was ratified, not any territories acquired later. In his view, the federal government did not have the authority to prohibit slavery in the Northwest Territory. As a result, the Missouri Compromise was invalid. Dred Scott remained a slave according to Missouri law, and he had no standing to sue in federal court. Dissents. Justices Benjamin Robbins, Curtis, and John McLean were the only members of the Supreme Court who disagreed with the majority ruling, and each wrote their own objections. Curtis composed a significant 67-page rebuttal, challenging the majority's assertion that black individuals could never be citizens of the United States on a federal level. He demonstrated that during the Constitution's ratification in 1789, black men were indeed eligible voters in 5 out of the original 13 states, confirming their status as both state and national citizens. He supported his argument with a variety of state laws and judicial precedents. His well-founded dissent was so compelling that it led Chief Justice Taney to expand his own opinion by an additional 18 pages in order to address Curtis's points. McLean's disagreement took issue with the idea that black people weren't citizens as being more about preference than legal fact. He criticized much of the court's reasoning as irrelevant commentary lacking legal weight, suggesting that when the court decided it could not preside over Scott's case, it should have ended matters there rather than deliberating further on the case itself. Curtis and McLean both criticized the decision to revoke the Missouri Compromise, arguing that this step was unnecessary. They stressed that no framers of the Constitution had ever challenged the legality of earlier laws set to restrict slavery, such as the Northwest Ordinance and the 1808 ban on slave importation. Curtis drew attention to the fact that the Constitution didn't acknowledge slavery as an inherent right, instead identifying it as a matter subject to statutory law. He cited the constitutional provision granting Congress the right to manage and establish the necessary guidelines regarding U.S. territories or properties, with no exclusion noted for slavery, implying that slavery regulation was within the legislative powers of Congress. Reactions. The Supreme Court's ruling in the Dred Scott case was met with intense anger from many parts of the United States, except for those states where slavery was practiced. The ruling shocked the judges and inflamed the already heated issue of slavery, rather than pacifying it. It also put the credibility of the judiciary at risk. The negative reaction to this decision was unparalleled, exceeding even the outcry that followed the Alien and Sedition Acts. Critics in the North lambasted Chief Justice Taney's opinion, accusing the press of intentionally misrepresenting and contorting his words. A Northern newspaper warned that following the Supreme Court's ruling would be tantamount to defying divine will. Leading Republicans, like Abraham Lincoln, who was emerging as a notable figure in Illinois, viewed the decision as a deliberate attempt to make slavery legal across all states. Some extreme voices in the South were advocating for slavery to be acknowledged as a constitutional right by every state. Lincoln challenged the court's assertion that the Constitution explicitly recognized a property right in slaves, arguing that it regarded slaves as persons, not property. Southern Democrats branded the Republicans as unruly dissenters, disturbing the peace by rejecting the Supreme Court's ruling as the definitive law. Northern opponents of slavery, referencing Justice Curtis's dissent, contended that the court lacked jurisdiction in the Dred Scott case, rendering the judgment advisory rather than an authoritative legal interpretation. Stephen Douglas criticized this viewpoint, expressing his respect for the Supreme Court's decision. During debates with Lincoln, he stressed obedience to the court's rulings. Lincoln, in response, clarified that the Republicans did not intend to disregard the Supreme Court, but rather sought to persuade it to overturn its Dred Scott decision. He acknowledged the importance of abiding by judicial rulings, while also recognizing that the court has historically revised its own rulings. Democrats had not always viewed the Supreme Court's constitutional interpretations as permanently binding. During Andrew Jackson's presidency, Taney, who was then the Attorney General, expressed that a single decision by the court does not irrevocably fix the meaning of the Constitution for all future scenarios. Frederick Douglass, a leading black abolitionist, denounced the decision as unconstitutional and against the intentions of the Founding Fathers. He optimistically believed that the decision would only serve to intensify the national struggle against slavery. Jefferson Davis, a U.S. Senator from Mississippi, who would later become President of the Confederacy, perceived the case as a question of whether black people should remain in slavery and whether Congress had any authority to define what could be considered property in the U.S. territories, citing the example of an Army officer who brought his slave into a territory. Impact on the litigants. In 1850, Irene Emerson relocated to Massachusetts, where she wed Calvin C. Chaffee, a medical doctor and anti-slavery advocate who later served in Congress representing both the Know Nothing and Republican parties. Following a decision by the Supreme Court, newspapers that supported slavery labeled Chaffee a hypocrite. Chaffee countered by clarifying that the ownership of Dred Scott was under his wife's brother and not within his control. Despite this, the Chaffees took legal action to initiate Dred Scott's liberation by transferring ownership to Henry Taylor Blow, Scott's previous owner's son. This transfer enabled Blow to formally petition for Scott's freedom in person in Missouri. On May 26, 1857, Judge Hamilton received the paperwork that granted Dred Scott and his family their freedom. This momentous event made headlines across the country and was met with celebrations in northern communities. Dred Scott himself gained a level of fame and worked as a hotel porter in St. Louis, while his wife made a living by doing laundry. Scott's life, however, was cut short by tuberculosis, leading to his death on November 7, 1858, while his wife Harriet passed away years later, on June 17, 1876. Economic aftermath. Economists Charles Calomiris and historian Larry Schweikart discovered that the financial markets were immediately thrown into disarray due to fears that the entire West might suddenly adopt slavery or be plunged into violent conflicts similar to those seen in Bleeding Kansas. This concern directly led to the insolvency of the East-West Railroad companies, though railways running north to south were not affected, which in turn sparked a series of bank runs on several large financial institutions, an event which came to be known as the Panic of 1857. This particular financial crisis, in contrast to the one in 1837, had a profound impact predominantly on the northern United States. Calomiris and Schweikart attributed this to the unique banking structure of the North. Characterized by unit banking, with numerous banks operating independently and often keeping financial information secret from one another, thereby creating an environment ripe for uncertainty. On the other hand, the South's banking system featured branch banking, where information was shared more freely between branches, resulting in a more contained and less severe impact of the financial panic in the South. Political aftermath. Individuals from the southern regions of the United States, who became uneasy with the Kansas-Nebraska Act, maintained that they had the legal right under the Constitution to take their slaves into new territories, regardless of any laws the local governments in those areas might enact. Their viewpoint appeared to be supported by the ruling in the Dred Scott case. However, while Chief Justice Taney hoped that this ruling would act as a conclusive resolution to the ongoing debate over slavery by turning a highly debated political issue into a definitive legal precedent, it had the reverse effect. The ruling actually intensified opposition to slavery in the northern states, caused a split within the Democratic Party along regional divides, emboldened pro-slavery advocates in the South to press for even more extreme measures, and gave a boost to the Republican Party. In 1860, the Republican Party formally denounced the Dred Scott decision in their platform. They asserted that the recent claim that the Constitution inherently legalizes slavery in all U.S. territories was a perilous misconception that contradicted the direct wording of the Constitution, historical interpretations, and established legal and legislative actions. They argued that this belief was not only wrong, but also threatened to disrupt the nation's stability and unity. Later references. In 1859, during the trial of John Anthony Copeland and Shields Green, who were implicated in John Brown's Harper's Ferry raid, their defense lawyer, George Sennett, referenced the infamous Dred Scott ruling. He stated that, based on this ruling that African Americans were not citizens, his clients could not possibly be guilty of treason. Despite this defense, Copeland and Green were still convicted on other counts and ultimately executed. Fast forward to 1896. Within an era marked by rampant racial discrimination, Justice John Marshall Harlan stood alone in opposition to the Supreme Court decision in the Plessy v. Ferguson case, which upheld the legality of racial segregation under the guise of separate but equal facilities. Harlan voiced concern that this decision would have detrimental effects akin to those of the Dred Scott case. In 1927, Charles Evans Hughes reflected on the Supreme Court's past, pointing to the Dred Scott decision as a significant misstep that harmed the court's reputation for a considerable time. Later, William H. Rehnquist, during his time as a clerk and before becoming Chief Justice himself, critiqued the Dred Scott case as Chief Justice Taney's failed attempt to prevent Congress from interfering with slavery, remarking on how this effort only served to exacerbate the nation's conflict over the issue. Justice Antonin Scalia drew a comparison between the logic used in the Planned Parenthood v. Casey case in 1992 and the rationale of the Dred Scott decision to criticize the Roe v. Wade ruling. He portrayed the Dred Scott case as an early instance of the Supreme Court's application of substantive due process, and suggested that it had a lasting negative impact on Taney's legacy, as it did little more than intensify the contentious slavery debate and contribute to the outbreak of the Civil War. Chief Justice John Roberts also paralleled the Obergefell v. Hodges decision of 2015 to the Dred Scott case, suggesting that both cases represented the court's overreach in attempting to resolve highly controversial issues beyond what he considered the proper constitutional boundaries. Legacy. In 1977, the great-grandson of the Scott family, John A. Madison, Jr., who worked as a lawyer, led the opening prayer during the event held at the Old Courthouse in St. Louis, a location recognized as a National Historic Landmark, to celebrate the introduction of a historical marker that acknowledges the legal battle the Scotts pursued in that very courthouse. In the year 2000, the legal documents from Harriet and Dred Scott's legal battle to win their freedom were put on public display at the primary location of the St. Louis Public Library. This exhibition was made possible following the uncovering of over 300 similar legal cases seeking freedom in the records of the United States Circuit Court. By 2006, a new historical marker was established at the Old Courthouse, which was dedicated to acknowledging the proactive efforts of Dred and Harriet Scott in their legal fight for freedom, as well as the profound impact their case had on the history of the United States. In 2012, a statue featuring Dred and Harriet Scott was unveiled at the eastern entrance of the Old Courthouse, strategically positioned to face the St. Louis Gateway Arch. This monument serves as a tribute to the couple's journey and fight for freedom.